The Japan-only game release. It's something that gamers from anywhere in the world other than Japan dread to think about sometimes. Now, the Japan-only release doesn't happen as often as it did in, let's say, the early 90s to mid-2000s, but it still is an occasional fear that many Western gamers have, especially for those niche games or those eccentric electronics. Games like My Summer Vacation for the original PlayStation or Kumauta for the PlayStation 2 are two examples of Japan-only games that, to this day, I still haven't played but speak to my gaming interests. Why can't I catch fireflies under the moonlight? Or give up my peaceful life as a polar bear to be a full-time pop singer? It just isn't fair. Gamers sometimes worry about Japan-only games because they may feel that they are missing out on something and won't be able to use their gaming consoles to their full potential. There are, of course, many reasons as to why the Japan-only release happens. Sometimes it's the adaptation costs for translations, not to mention the additional voiceover work in other languages, and that isn't feasible in smaller game budgets. Culturally, some games just aren't significant enough for Western audiences to understand. And sometimes it's just because some of the games are so advanced for your simple minds that you can't even comprehend the sheer genius of how far ahead of its time these games are, and that the Japanese market doesn't want to overwhelm you with such awesomeness. You're just not ready for it. I see nothing weird about this. On one occasion, while delving into Japan-only releases for the original Nintendo, I was met with a pleasant and visually appealing platforming action game that I had never heard of. Moon Crystal, exclusively released for the Nintendo Famicom in 1992 from the game developer Hect. There were so many well-written articles I stumbled upon that gave wonderful descriptions about the game's history and game design that only added to my sense of intrigue. The thing that was mentioned the most was the striking movement of the game's main character, Ricky Slater, and how the game designers added extra frames of animation to him, which gave way to smoother movement and a more visually pleasing sprite that moved across the screen. I mentioned in previous videos that emulation has been a big part of how I've played many games from my past. I still very much stick by this formula as it's given me some incredible and reliable results. A great thing about the game emulation community is that there are a ton of games that have been translated into many different languages that were once Japan-only release games. Moon Crystal happened to be one of those games that had been lovingly translated into the English language. So I downloaded it, and after loading it onto my Raspberry Pi's SD card and successfully getting it to work on the Recalbox operating system, I decided to delve into Moon Crystal, this Japan-only release for the Famicom, but in my case, the original Nintendo Entertainment System. Subscribe to the Select Gaming to keep up to date with all our latest videos. This is Moon Crystal for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Moon Crystal opens in typical NES form with a cutscene that introduces us to the main character, Ricky Slater, along with some other characters in this game. Unbeknownst to me, because I went in completely blind on the story of this game, I will say that I was not expecting it to start in the realm of the supernatural or on the spooky side. The images you are first met with are very reminiscent of games like Castlevania and Ghosts and Goblins. One night in the small village of Cirrus, all of its citizens were abducted by an unknown army of soldiers and taken away, all except for one person, Ricky Slater, our hero in this adventure. He then embarks on a quest to find and save his family along with all the other villagers that were kidnapped. Ricky's father's last words before being abducted was that this group of bandits are after the Moon Crystal. His father, being a scientist, had long studied the powers of the Moon Crystal and tells Ricky of its sacred power, specifically when the moon is full and when it is at its peak potential of power. As you progress after every stage, You'll begin to meet other characters and understand why this darkness has befallen the people of this village. You later find out that the people have been kidnapped by the evil Count Crimson. As a result of using the moon crystal, the Count seeks to control the world by turning the dead into living beings through a device called the Luna System. The Count then forces Ricky's father to help him complete the Luna System now that he has the moon crystal in his possession. After its completion, the Count can then use it to his advantage so that the dead he revives will then be used as soldiers in his army. With the help of a mysterious girl named Rosina, who later reveals to you that she is the daughter of the Count, only Ricky can save the villagers and stop this monstrous evil and restore order. The game is broken up into 7 different stages, and all of them have a very different setting and enemies to fight your way through. In what starts as a bright and colorful side-scrolling adventure surrounded by nature, it slowly evolves into settings of bigger cities, a pirate boat, a dark and mysterious castle, and finally an underground industrial mining facility where you'll spend most of your time in the game towards its conclusion. Moon Crystal does take a very dystopian turn in its design choices towards the end. It's a bit of a shame that you do end up spending so much time in these very dark levels rather than the more open and brighter levels that you start with in the game's beginning. But the plot of this game does command it to feel a bit more like a steampunk adventure. One of the things that you'll instantly notice, and a big reason as to why this Japan-only release has gotten so much praise and attention over the years, is because of the animation of the playable sprite of Ricky. He almost looks like he belongs in a Super Nintendo game. His double jumps just have a weight to them that I've never felt on any other NES sprites, and the gameplay mechanic of being able to grab onto ledges and lift yourself up to higher platforms does add a nice dimension to the level design. Ricky in many ways feels like the unnamed protagonist in the original 1989 Prince of Persia game for the Apple II computer, and you can feel the influence of that game in Moon Crystal. Now, just because the character of Ricky is incredibly impressive in his movement and is exceptionally eye-catching, this doesn't mean that it doesn't come without any flaws. You see, there's a reason why most of the games in those days had very limited animations on their playable characters, and even though Ricky is impressive, he is a perfect example of how things can get very complicated very quickly if consistency in the levels and bosses change that don't suit the controls of the character you are playing as in the start of the game. Ricky is a character that works so well in the open platforming sections where he can double jump and grab onto ledges freely. But as the game progresses and sections begin to get more confined and claustrophobic, his movement starts to get problematic. The movements you were making in those open sections where you were jumping from building to building don't work so well in a mining cave where the tunnels and spaces are much more limited. The best way to describe these flawed moments of Ricky's movement is that it sort of feels like Ricky is walking on slippery ice when you're turning and running about in these very tight platforming sections. Particularly, the biggest downfall of Ricky's added frames is during some of the boss battles. They can be summed up at times as an abysmal mess, with really no method to the madness at times. At first, the boss battles seem to be pretty standard, and you're forced to learn the pattern of movements to a particular boss, then execute the best scenario of your movement to defeat them. Future boss battles become these close combat affairs where you are just button mashing your sword against them before your life runs out. That was pretty much the method I had to take with a few of these guys because there just wasn't enough space in certain boss battles to really explore different ways to go about beating them. Not to mention that the later bosses are incredibly difficult and powerful, so you really need to prepare yourself for Moon Crystal because you are jumping into the early 90s hard boss battles. I would have been perfectly okay with the difficulty of the bosses, but the thing is, when you die from a boss battle, you are sent to the beginning of the level, and for me, That is just way too punishing and a big oversight from the game developers that will definitely hurt the mood and flow of any gamer when they have to go through a whole level again instead of starting from the boss battle off the top while things are still fresh to figure out. It still does succeed overall in many areas if you're willing to put in the time and familiarize yourself with the levels and the bosses. You'll end up having one of the more memorable gaming experiences on the NES. The music overall has a wonderfully composed soundtrack and adds a lot to the cutscenes as the story continues to play out and eventually concludes in a very satisfying end to everything. Now, there are two things that make me feel incredibly stressed out in video games. The first thing is when the hookers in Grand Theft Auto just won't die the first time you run over them. Wait, what? And the second thing are countdowns in video games. I freaking despise them, and for some reason, they happen to be in some of my favorite video games. Moon Crystal at the 11th hour decides that they are going to end this game on a bang, and they are not messing around. After beating probably one of the hardest bosses I've ever faced up against in my gaming career, like an absolute legend, I was thrown into my biggest and greatest fear of the video game countdown to finally save the villagers and restore order to my beautiful village to what it once was. Guess you could say the Count's plan really bombed. Moon Crystal, even though flawed at points, is by no means a failure. On the contrary, Moon Crystal is an incredible game for the original Nintendo, but for some it may feel like a bit of a frustrating experience that isn't worth the extra added frames of animation to Ricky, which I can totally sympathize with. The game has an interesting story and it's a great piece of late NES gaming. If you are a fan of these side-scrolling platformers, you will find some redeeming qualities in Moon Crystal. At this current point in time, sadly, there aren't many ways to play Moon Crystal. I myself mentioned that I played it on an emulator. However, if you do search hard enough on the internet, you'll manage to find and snag a reproduction copy that comes with English translations and can be played in your original NES hardware or many other clone systems. After that, you're sort of out of luck, as the only real option on how to play this game is from owning a Famicom and a Famicom copy of Moon Crystal. And unless you're willing to fork up the cash for it, you can always watch our long play of Moon Crystal on our channel. Moon Crystal is a great technical achievement for the NES and a solid platformer. Hopefully, it'll get the respect it deserves one day to either be re-released or exist in a digital form where it can be purchased and enjoyed by gamers everywhere. Thank you for joining me on this episode of The Select Gaming. If you like what you've seen and heard, give us a like and subscribe. This is Dusty Maxwell, and we'll see you on the next one.